All right, well, here we go. This is the final installment, hopefully, as long as the camera holds up, and we're picking up the second half of chapter 7, which is the end of the book, and we're starting on page 142, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul by William Chittick. Here we go. From the perspective of philosophical tradition, the deepest root of the human self is the first intellect, which knows every potentiality of phenomenal existence. It is the intellect that gives birth to the universe in a centrifugal process analogous to the diffusion of light. Life, it needs to be remembered, actualizes a more intense degree of reality than lack of life. Life is an attribute of the real, and among its traces are coherence and integration. In contrast, lack of life pertains to relative dispersion and incoherence. Moreover, life does not exist on the same plane as dead, inert material things. We cannot analyze life per se, only its activities, signs, and traces. Life is already, in a profound sense, unseen and spiritual. Because life escapes fixity, it is less amenable than bodily things to mathematical analysis and technological manipulations. Its essential invisibility helps to explain why biology can never be a hard science and why medicine will always be faced with the problem of determining the moment of death. Our only real knowledge of life is firsthand, inside ourselves. But where exactly do we know life? Life is essentially invisible and non-localizable. This is even more true of awareness, which embraces the reality of life but simultaneously pertains to a higher level of being, further removed from inanimate and closer to the first real. Animal awareness, however, has severe constraints that become apparent as soon as we meditate upon the differences between human and animal possibilities. In effect, animals cannot transcend non-reflexive awareness of their environment. In contrast, human beings have the potential of moving beyond the limitations and constraints of the animal plane and reflecting on the self that knows. In other words, human beings can aim for freedom from their environmental limitations, not just physical limitations, but also social, political, and psychological limitations. Much more profoundly, they can strive for freedom from all limitation and constraints. To do so, they need to extirpate what Buddhists call the three poisons: anger, greed, and ignorance. The basic impediments to freedom are the imperfections of the self, its failure to actualize its own reality. Ultimately, as Hindus know, freedom is the name of true and realized selfhood. This is precisely realization, which is achieved by freeing or disengaging the self from everything less than self. Inanimate things, plants, animals, are limited and therefore definable. Human beings are definable only inasmuch as they live beneath themselves. Any definition of human nature pertains to a level of being that lies beneath true selfhood. Definition pertains to realms that are essentially limited, such as the inanimate, the vegetal, the physiological, the animate, and the psychic. Consciousness is not essentially limited. It itself is the subject that perceives limits, boundaries, and definitions. Strictly human modalities of being pertain to pure consciousness and pure awareness. The human selfhood cannot be defined, yet it gives rise to every distinction and differentiation. Those human beings who fully realize their own selfhood, their innate, unlimited intelligence and consciousness, thereby gain freedom from every constraint. It can also be said that there is no definition of the human self adequate to taking control of it and putting it to use. The self in itself is always free, despite the external constraints and controls that may be placed upon the bodily and animal planes of human nature, and despite the internal ignorance and illusion that typically veil the self from seeing things as they are and knowing its own freedom. Epistemologically, this means that true human selfhood cannot be the object of transmitted knowledge. It can only be known by direct, unmediated knowledge. We cannot know ourselves by reading about ourselves, carrying out controlled experiments, listening to what other people have said about us, or examining what we observe of other people's selves. We can only know ourselves inside ourselves and without intermediary of any instruments. These instruments include not only simple scientific devices, but also the five senses, imagination, and thought, all of which are tools of the self. In short, the human self per se dwells in a realm of being that transcends its own instruments. With even more reason, the source of the self, which is the first real, is inaccessible to the instruments of the self and even to the self itself. As Sufis put it, none knows God but God. Any real knowledge of God is simply the omnipresent God knowing himself through the human self, which is ultimately the first intellect, the radiance of divine light. Meaning, page 144. Let me now turn to the question implied by the title of this chapter. How does one search for meaning in the intellectual tradition? It needs to be stressed that meaning is found by the knowing self inside itself, not outside. There's no meaning out there, over and apart from the observer. It is absurd to suppose that anything in the world can have meaning apart from a self that is observing and understanding. The universe exists only as a sign of the real. The question of the search for meaning then comes down to this: can we know the meaning of the universe or any object within it without knowing the meaning of the real? Can we know ourselves anywhere else than within ourselves? Certainly we can know the meaning of some things in relation to other things. All our disciplines provide this sort of meaning, though of course they provide it to those who understand the meaning, who find it within themselves. But what about the meaning of things as they really are, not in relation to other things, to this observer or that observer, but to the absolute observer? What about the meaning of things as they are situated in the infinitely complex web of intersecting journeys coming from the real and returning to the real? Given that human selves cannot be defined, they have no fixed standpoint within themselves. They have the potentiality of defining and understanding everything beneath their own level, and they have the ability to choose their standpoint in trying to understand. This means that people can look at the universe and themselves from a vast diversity of perspectives. The historical proliferation of cultures and worldviews is more than enough to show that the possible viewpoints allowing human beings to address the world and to search for meaning are beyond count. The proliferation of viewpoints, however, shows that the viewers are not, in fact, constrained in any essential way or confined to any specific viewpoint. Hence, it is possible to step outside all viewpoints, all the ways of looking at the world that are conditioned by history, culture, religion, and science. The great spiritual and contemplative traditions that are intellectual in the way I'm using the word, are unanimous in declaring that it is indeed possible to become free of limitations and to act as the vehicle through which the unobserved observer observes. Human possibility transcends time, space, history, physicality, energy, ideation, the angels, and gods themselves, though not God in the proper sense of the word. It is precisely this possibility of transcendence that makes the highest human calling. Indeed, when a tradition acknowledges this calling, it also acknowledges that this alone is the only truly human calling. Every other calling turns people away from their root selfhood, which is the image of the supreme reality, if not that reality itself. Every other calling represents misdirected love. In short, the intellectual tradition maintains that the human self has the potential to go beyond every standpoint and every perspective, to step outside culture, history, and even the universe. The tradition calls the selfhood that achieves this freedom from all constraint the standpoint of no standpoint. This ultimate standpoint is non-specific and indefinable, so it encompasses every specific and definable standpoint. But in order to reach the standpoint of no standpoint, one must harness the various dimensions that make up the external manifestation of the soul's reality, body, soul, mind, thought, imagination, and attach them to the centripetal movement going back to the center. Despite these two movements, centrifugal and centripetal, descending and ascending, intelligence per se never leaves its own invisible and transcendent reality. In its deepest nature, the human self is indistinguishable from intelligence, so it remains indefinable and non-specific. Every specific thing and every specific viewpoint tells the self what it is not. The self knows that it is not limited by the objects of its knowledge, or by the finiteness of things, nor by the limitations of this standpoint or this science. It also knows that it has the potential to perceive and comprehend all definitions and limitations. Hence it knows, if it is aware of itself, that it has no inherent limitations. It is free, not of this or that, but of all things, of everything less than the real. Reattaching oneself to the first intelligence is the goal of aspiring intellectuals. They want to make actual what is potential within themselves. But in order to achieve full realization, they must abandon dependence upon transmitted knowledge and come to know for themselves. To the degree that they do so, they rejoin the intelligence from which the soul departed at the outset, and they achieve omniscience, though not in a differentiated way. This is a unitary understanding and awareness of all things at their root. It is a spontaneous knowing, a blossoming of consciousness, an awakening to reality, all without reflection or thought. It is to see things as they are seen by the first intellect, before their appearance as coagulations in the universe. From the standpoint of the intellectual tradition, every search for meaning that takes a specific standpoint, physics, medicine, sociology, theology, is constrained and limited by its premises and presuppositions. The discovered meaning will always be defined by the starting point. In contrast, in a purely intellectual quest, the only presupposition is the unity of the infinite, absolute, and unknown reality, which has no specific definition and stands in no standpoint. It is this non-specific goal that is sought by the seeker. The quest can have no closure, because the infinite and absolute can never be reached, though it reaches everywhere. As long as human beings take finite things or a defined and known God as the object of their quest, they can never know the true and final meaning of the universe and themselves. Conclusions are inextricably linked to premises. Only the premise of Tawhid, the transcendence, infinity, and absoluteness of the one reality, allows the achievement of the full potential of the self. The conclusion of the quest will be the same as the first step, for no real steps can be taken without already being aware of the goal. At the beginning, however, Tawhid is simply an inchoate intuition. It is then awakened and articulated by transmitted knowledge. Gradually, it can grow into an actualized understanding, then a rational certainty, and then a super-rational comprehension of the way things are, and then a vision that transcends the vision of the eyes, just as ocular vision transcends blindness. All these, however, are preliminary stages of consciousness. The goal is to realize Tawhid for oneself and in oneself. One must find oneself and all things in their total context. The soul must come to recognize itself as a ray of the absolute mind, infinite light. The beginning, then, is intuition and innate perception. The end is the realization of being and knowledge and bliss. From the standpoint of this tradition, any search for the meaning of things and objects that does not allow seekers to open themselves up to the depths of their own self will be an obstacle in the task of learning how to be human. It is impossible to know the meaning of anything without establishing a standpoint from which to speak of meaning. As long as the standpoint is determined by transmitted knowledge or theoretical frameworks, it will be limited by its givens. Only a standpoint of no standpoint can allow for transcending standpoints and arrive at the meaning behind all relative and situational meanings. The standpoint of no standpoint is available only in the transcendent realm that gives rise to the universe in the first place. True meaning can never be grasped by dogma, doctrine, theories, theorems, or any other mental construct. It can only be found by going beyond the operations of the mind, actualizing the unitary awareness of primordial intelligence that lies behind the mind and behind the world, and integrating the human self back into the transcendent origin. Okay, well, now I'm going to give you my final thoughts about this book. I give it my highest rating. It's a great, great book. I'm really willing to say that it is definitely worth the price to purchase this book. I've presented my summary, but I'd say this is a great 25 or 30 bucks. But I do want to take exception with the final statement of the book, and I'm going to diverge from Chittick's perspective. Here's the final statement, quote, "True meaning can only be found by going beyond the operations of the mind, actualizing the unitary awareness of primordial intelligence that lies behind the mind and behind the world, and integrating the human self back into the transcendent origin." Okay, so there's 3 phrases there, and I'm actually going to take issue with all 3 of them. Okay, so the first one is that true meaning is found by, quote, going beyond the operations of the mind. Okay, so I don't believe that we are properly meant to go beyond the operations of the mind. For me, the rational level is where our true identity is found. It's the intersection between the spiritual level, which is intuitive, and then we have the natural level, which is the outward collective consciousness. So our rational mind is typically where we make choices and determine reality for ourselves through the act of, comparing the inner level with the outer level. And so to find meaning is found through creating those sorts of definitions. So for me, my individuality is experienced in my rationality. So that's phrase 1. The second phrase says that we need to actualize the unitary awareness of primordial intelligence that lies behind the mind and behind the world. So actualizing the unitary awareness of primordial intelligence, to me, means somehow becoming permanently conscious of this root intelligence that he's calling primordial. So for me, it's pretty obvious that our minds function sequentially. Okay, so to actualize awareness of the primordial is, not possible, really, because we perceive reality moment to moment. So we never have a stable awareness. So we can't actualize a primordial awareness. The primordial, to me, is also sort of an unattractive notion. It sounds like it's sort of a collective chaos. And, the amount of effort that I've put into differentiating my identity, my rationality, my perspective from the collective chaos is something that I am not readily willing to give up. So to reintegrate into the primordial intelligence doesn't sound good to me. And then the final phrase he uses is integrate the human self back into the transcendent origin. And so that's kind of similar to the previous statement where it says actualizing an awareness of the primordial intelligence. So integrating the human self back into the transcendent origin. So I don't believe that that is God's purpose in creation. I don't believe that God wants us to reintegrate our individuality back into the transcendent origin. Reintegration is not part of creation. That actually seems to me to be uncreation. God did not create us as temporary offspring. We are permanently created. God doesn't give life and then take it away. I do like, what he said right towards the end of attaining the standpoint of no standpoint, because it expresses the fact of our actual freedom to be what we want, the freedom to reinvent ourselves whenever we want, to eternity. So actual freedom must be extended to eternity. And Swedenborg says that we're an empty vessel, but that emptiness does not mean that we are nothing. Okay, we're not something the way God is something. Okay, we're not permanent the way God is permanent. But we are something, and we are permanent because God grants us to be something, and God grants us the gift of life to eternity. God sustains his gift to us, and I believe it's his absolute intention to sustain this gift of life and freedom, because that is perfect creation. Okay, and that's how God realizes being God, which is the infinite, perfect, real creator. Swedenborg says that our fulfillment is found in becoming a useful individual member of heavenly society. Our individuality is fulfilled by remaining an individual, but we're integrated into the heavenly collective, which draws never-ending sustenance from the actual intelligence itself, which is God. And we find our fulfillment in contributing to the universal collective well-being. Okay, so there you go. That's, the traditional Islamic philosophy that Chittick is expressing to us found its fulfillment in attaining to actualized intelligence. Okay, whereas Swedenborg brings it more to a practical conclusion, saying that it's in taking our individual actualized intelligence and making ourselves useful in the collective. So he kind of goes above and beyond Chittick on that. Okay, but all in all, this is a terrific book, and I highly recommend it, and I appreciate you hanging in here. If you've watched all the way to this point, well done. 9 long episodes. And anyway, so please like and subscribe, and I don't know what's coming next, whether it'll be more on mystical Islam, or I'm actually thinking about taking on the subject of spiritual healing. That's a big one. All right. Anyway, this is David Higgins signing off. Thank you for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. Adios.